All right, we are continuing through the book of John. This time we are in chapter 5, starting with verse 1 and going through about the first half of verse 9. It splits kind of at a paragraph split, so we'll just end in the middle of verse 9 and pick back up in the second half in the next one. So I'll start reading and then we will talk about it. So John 5, starting in verse 1. After this there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. So, one thing you may notice right away in those verses that I just read is that there is no verse 4. It goes straight from verse 3 to verse 5. And that is because I am reading out of the ESV, the English Standard Version, and the folks who put that together left out verse 4 because it is not included in the earliest manuscripts for the book of John. So it is included in some versions, it is not included in other versions, and a lot of that just has to do with the history and the way that we know the Bible was compiled, and so this is something that does appear in later versions of this writing, but does not appear in the earliest versions. So instead of just ignoring it, we just kind of skip over it so as not to cause confusion. So the references still make sense. But if you want to know what it says in verse 4, it basically says that an angel comes periodically and stirs up the water. And when the water is stirred up, the first person to get in gets healed. So that's to give you some context of what this man is attempting to accomplish, whether you include verse 4 or not, or believe that that was the case, that there was an angel stirring it up. It certainly, from the context, seems to be the case that this man believed that. So he certainly thought that if he could be the first one into the water, that he could be healed. I don't know, given that the verse seems to have been added later, we don't really know if it was an angel stirring it up or not. I do think it's interesting, though, if you're talking about a pool of water, which this is a pool, so it's not it's not running water, it's not a river. So if you see a pool get stirred up, if you see water that is still get stirred up, it generally happens because of, something interacts with it, and usually the wind, right? You can see this happen if it's a windy day and you have a pool or you have a pond or something and you look and you see it moving around, the wind blows it. So I do think it's interesting, even if you think about it as simple as the wind, it wouldn't be the first time, even in the book of John, when the wind gets compared to the Spirit, because Jesus uses that exact parallel when he's talking to Nicodemus. So it's quite possible that it is an angel. It's quite possible it has some other something else to do with God controlling it, or that it's the wind, and there are other ways that God interacts with healing folks. So either way, we don't know exactly what's going on there, but we do know that this man certainly believes that that's his chance to be healed. He's been there for a long time, waiting for his opportunity, and he has never managed to be the first one in. He's 38 years old. It says, or no, sorry. It doesn't say he's 38 years old. It says he's been an invalid for 38 years. So we don't know how old he is. Could have been an accident that happened that left him probably paralyzed. It doesn't say exactly what his particular situation is, but likely he is paralyzed, and that would explain why he can't get into the water by himself. So we don't know if something happened in his life that caused him to be paralyzed, or if he was born paralyzed and he's been that way for 38 years. We really don't know. Either way, even if he's 38 years old, he's fairly old for the time. The lifespan is right around that, so he's as old as the average person's going to be before they pass at that point in time. Obviously, some people live longer and some don't. Jesus never makes it to the age of 35 on earth, so that gives you some idea. But if this guy was injured, then he's even older than that. So you can kind of get an idea of what we're talking about here in terms of a person and how he's going to compare to the people around him. So there's a few things I think that are interesting about this story in particular, and the fact that the way John puts it in here, he goes, I'm not a, grammatical, biblical scholar or anything, but just in terms of the literature and the storytelling here, if you look at the first few stories that John tells, the first miracle happens at the wedding at Cana, and then at the end of verse 4, Jesus is in Cana again when he has this interaction with the official and talks to him about his son. So there's kind of bookends to this idea of these experiences that Jesus has there. And then another section kind of starts here in verse 5. So he's now starting at this structure with the pools and the colonnades. And there's another verse that we'll get to several chapters from now that kind of closes this with another scenario that is kind of at a similar structure with colonnades that get referenced. So John is kind of setting the scene. He's kind of setting up some literary structure around the stories that he's telling to kind of put them into some, chunks or ways for us to kind of separate them and think about them and the themes that he's trying to push, I guess, the themes he's trying to get us to understand. Another thing that I think is interesting when you look at this story in particular, we've seen up till now Jesus have one-on-one interactions with only a handful of people. So we've seen several miracles. We've seen, the wedding at Cana. We've seen the temple, but those were kind of Jesus and crowds. But when we think about one-on-one interactions, we see Jesus with Nathaniel, and then we see Jesus with Nicodemus, and then we see the woman at the well, and then we see the official, and now this one. And so there's some interesting things, kind of parallels between each of these. When you think about, Nicodemus and even Nathaniel, Jesus is talking to somebody who doesn't necessarily have a full understanding of how God works and how the Spirit works, but they clearly have some faith. They clearly want to understand. This guy isn't necessarily saying he wants to understand, but he clearly has faith that something happens with this water. He clearly has some belief, but he doesn't fully understand how healing happens. So there's kind of a similarity there. When we see the woman at the well, we see, she's kind of caught off guard. Jesus kind of initiates a conversation with her. Similar thing here. This guy doesn't go up to Jesus and ask for healing. He's just there trying to do what he does, and Jesus initiates with him, kind of takes him out of his normal routine and introduces him to this whole, new way of living his life, which is exactly what he does with the woman at the well. Also with the woman at the well, Jesus references parts of her life that she doesn't think he has any way of knowing. Same thing kind of happens with Nathaniel. He talks about him being under the tree. And then here it says Jesus understands that this guy has been at this for a while. So he has some understanding of these people and their lives before he interacts with them. And then the official son is actually the first physical healing that we see in the book of John. And then obviously this is the second. So not that everything is, intertwined to some huge degree, but it is interesting to just kind of think about how all of these things kind of connect in the different ways Jesus interacts with people. Sometimes he talks about their past to get them to understand. Sometimes there's physical healing that takes place. Sometimes he's just initiating and taking people out of their routine and waking them up. Sometimes they're coming to him because they want to understand. Sometimes, they understand basically nothing, and he has to, educate them from scratch. Sometimes they're pretty well educated, and he's trying to get them, over the hump, so to speak. So a lot of different ways he interacts with people, but I just think it's interesting to kind of acknowledge those and keep track of them as we go through the book of John, because you'll see Jesus be very versatile in what he's doing. And you also see, and we've mentioned this before, that Jesus is very particular to the needs of the person. So he's addressing what it is that they're struggling with in each case, and that means different things for everybody. Uh, and then the final thing in the book of John, it comes up a lot, and obviously I've talked about it a lot, is this symbolism of water and what does it mean? It comes up over and over again through baptism and through the what he turns into wine at the wedding is water, and he talks to Nicodemus about water, and it's the water at the well, and him explaining that water is that he is the living water that's better than the water that the woman's going to get from the well. And so obviously water plays a part in this story as well. I'm not going to try to get into all the symbolism of all of it, but it is certainly true in this case that Jesus doesn't need water to do his healing. The water doesn't serve any purification purpose. The water doesn't have any role in this healing that takes place. This is just Jesus telling this man to get up and walk, and he does. He certainly could have helped the man get into the water to help him be the first one. He could have, he obviously traveled with a group of people, so if he couldn't have gotten the guy by himself, they could have all helped get the guy into the water first, and probably still would have been pretty compassionate of him to take a complete stranger who clearly has been struggling for a long time to try to get the healing to help him get there. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't leverage the water at all. He doesn't help the man accomplish the thing that the man thinks he needs to be healed. Jesus handles it on his own this time. And he really doesn't even touch him. He doesn't lay hands on him that we see. There's no reference to any of that. He doesn't, put, mud in his eyes or any of the other things that we see him do with some of the other people. So again, not similar to, exactly like he did with the official son. He just said, be healed, and he was healed. So this is, again, not surprising when it comes to John and the way he's telling this story, because if we go back to the very beginning of the book, Jesus is the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. So we know that this idea of the Word and speaking things into existence, including healing of a likely paralyzed person, is a representative of Christ being God. So that's all I had in terms of specific breakdown of what's going on in this passage. One other thing that just kind of sticks out to me that I think is something good for us to discuss, so I'm not going to try to go in depth on it, but it's just the idea that we know Jesus walks into a place where there are lots of people who are sick and hurting, and it lists out, there's invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. All of that's listed there in verse 3. It says a multitude. So there's a lot of people there suffering, struggling, fighting for the opportunity to be the one person that gets healed whenever this pool gets stirred up, and they have no clue and no control over when that happens. And so Jesus picks this one guy, and I think that there is, obviously there are reasons, and God has his ways, and we don't necessarily understand his ways and won't necessarily understand his ways, but I do think that there's some potential for, some challenge or some wrestling on our part to understand why it works that way. Why pick this one guy? Why not the next guy in line, or why not somebody else? And, there's all the unseen things we don't understand about what's in this man's heart and what opportunities this gives God or Jesus to make his glory known on earth. And then all those things, I get that. But if you're somebody who's also there hurting, to see this guy come and heal him and not you, what does that do to you? And what does that do to us to see that? We're in a time right now, just in our world, where there's a lot of suffering going on. There's a lot of potential for any one of us to be suffering, or even be in the position of being far closer to death. And we don't know or have any control over who gets healed and who doesn't. And so I kind of made the questions, even though, the passage was fairly short and my talk was fairly short. I only had 2 questions. But to me, that's the biggest question here is, do you struggle with the idea of Jesus choosing to heal some people but not others? So, I just think that's something that we all need to work out for ourselves, and maybe just take some time to sort that out. And then the other one is just, how does the difference in verses included versus excluded affect how you view the Bible? So some versions might have verse 4, some versions might not have it. What does that say about this book and how much we believe it or should believe it, or what questions there are that might arise because of those types of things. So let's talk about those two things. Hopefully, those are big enough ideas to get you thinking, because they are for me. So we'll see you soon. Thanks.